real concurrent viewers. It's really weird. Like on the
Oh,
preview
yeah.
window, it says like it'll be like really low, like 3, and then when I click on analytics, it'll say like 30. I'm like, oh right, so
Everyone's
great.
just
What's
sat there.
happening? All right, cool. Guys on YouTube, let us know if we're coming through loud and clear. I believe we should be. And yeah, welcome to this afternoon session. Ollie, you okay?
This morning's afternoon session. It does bridge the gap,
It
doesn't
is.
it?
It's like
That's true.
it's a weird middle ground 11, isn't it?
It is. It is. But you know, it works. It works on many levels. Just before lunch, you see people work up an appetite, and then they're ready for it come the end.
Exactly.
Right. I'm getting my notes up. I'm sorry for
right.
being
Cool.
tardy here.
People are in
Just
Zoom.
making sure I'm doing the right things, talking about the right things. What do you reckon? Should we just go for it?
Yeah, mate. Yeah, I think we're all good to go, mate.
Right. Yeah, as always, Jake, just field questions, chuck them my way.
Yep.
I'll open up Discord actually so I can see what's coming through. He says, where's Discord? There we go. And yeah, just as ever, everybody, please send in questions as and when you think of them, and we'll deal with them either at that moment or we might have to come back to them at the end. But post them wherever you may be, YouTube or in Discord, and hopefully we'll get to all of your questions. So today's session is mastering colour, which if those of you who are familiar with with stuff that I put out might realise is also the name of my MZ colour grading masterclass that was that last year? I've lost track of time, to be honest. You could tell me it's 2030, I'd believe you. I think it was last year Mastering Colour came out. And so this is just like a really cut down version of some of the topics that I touch on in that course, which I think actually is about 6, 7, 8, who knows, something like that, 6 or 7 hours long, that course on MZ. So obviously we've only got a couple of hours to get through that. So I'm going to kind of skip through some of the topics. I'm going to try and kind of dip into each of the different sections that we cover in that full masterclass. I think the first thing to point out about this this course, I mean, I was putting together the topics and the kind of bare bones of it, is I was trying to create a video online training course that mimicked in many ways the way I felt when I got hold of a book years ago called The Colorist's Handbook by Alexis van Herkman, who's an absolute legend. Alexis, this sounds like a hyperbole. He literally wrote the manual for DaVinci Resolve. I'm not making that up. He actually writes the manual as well as putting out loads of other content. And I first became aware of Alexis years and years ago when I still worked for Apple, because he'd done a similar thing with, I think it would have been Final Cut Pro, it may have been Motion. I can't quite remember now. It was a while ago. Maybe it was even Color. That would be more logical. Alexis, let me know. I've forgotten what book it was you were involved with. But I used to work for Apple, and that's when I first started teaching as an Apple certified master trainer, and that was when I first became aware of Alexis. So when his book, The Colorist's Handbook, came out, I grabbed it, and I still recommend it to people to this day as a kind of as a text resource. It's a really useful book. It's aged fairly well, and the reason why it's aged so well, and this is why I decided to kind of take a similar approach with my own online course, Mastering Color, was the fact that it tackles the big things, the big workflow things with color grading. It's not a book, and neither is my course, about how to use Resolve or how to use the Lumetri panel or how to use any specific software whatsoever. It kind of references those things, and often in the context of talking about a type of tool, it might show a screen grab, or in my case, in my course, where I'm using Resolve throughout. But well, actually, there's a little bit of Final Cut Pro when we're doing the ProRes RAW stuff. But the idea is that it's things that completely are irrelevant of source material and irrelevant of the software that you choose to use. So these are big headline subjects that any colorist coming into this kind of profession and looking to become a professional colorist themselves should wrap their heads around. And it was a really lovely course to make, actually, and it was a great opportunity just to kind of share all of this kind of stuff that you don't typically get. And I guess this was the other big thing for me, which made it even more relevant. Alexis had done it with his book, and that's, that longevity, that making it so it wasn't irrelevant. As soon as Resolve version 16 came out, it didn't mean anything. I didn't want to do a course like that. And just in the same way that Alexis's book has stood the test of time, I wanted the course to do that. And I think in my case, what was even more relevant, which was probably less relevant at the time when Alexis wrote his book, was the fact that there's a huge number now of YouTubers who are very keen to create sort of bite-sized short tips and tutorials about specific things within software, or recreating a specific look to match a film, for example. And I think that stuff's great, and I think it's really entertaining, and in a very short sort of bite-sized way, it's great fodder for YouTube, and it's a great way to kind of build up an audience. Maybe I should start doing this. I genuinely don't have the time, unfortunately, but I do think that my measly 1,300 social media account on Instagram would surely benefit if I started to do more stuff like this. But I think the thing with me, not only do I not have the time, I think the general idea of thinking that this world of color grading can be boiled down into this sort of bite-sized sort of 5-minute, this is how I'm going to make this look type thing. I think it really misses the point. And if you're getting into color grading and you're only watching that type of content, I think you're going to really struggle, because it only really tackles the creative side. I actually think the creative side is in many ways the easiest bit, because you either kind of have that or you don't. It's like any art form, you're either kind of in touch with that side, and you have that ability just to create something that's aesthetically pleasing and visually interesting, or you kind of don't. I mean, you can practice it, but I think that's really a gut kind of thing. And although it touches on that beautifully, color grading is 50% that and 50% technical know-how, workflow, understanding of a lot of the stuff we talked about last week. I think it was last week, again, lost track of time, where we were talking about things like chroma subsampling and the human visual system and all these sort of more scientific things that are the foundations of it. So I think like what I was trying to do with Mastering Color was kind of fill in that void in between, so that someone could watch that and then start to build on top of that with some of these more sort of bite-sized YouTube tutorials. I should point out, forgive me if I keep rubbing my face and touching my nose. It's, what are we now, 29th of May. Like clockwork, every year I get terrible hay fever just before June and throughout June. So I trust me, it's just an itch. I'm not like, I don't have coronavirus. You're not going to catch anything, do I? So what I was going to touch on first of all, and similarly touch on first of all in Mastering Color, is setting up a color grading suite. So I'm in my own color suite now, and I could sort of, I'm not going to bring my camera around and start showing you stuff. I'm just going to talk in kind of broad terms about what you kind of want as an environment if you're setting up for color grading. 2 seconds. So the first thing to consider when you're color grading and you're setting up a dedicated space for color grading is how you're going to control the light, because you can't let any mixed lighting sources enter the space where you're going to be grading. And the reason for that is really straightforward. So our eyes balance to a neutral white point. Wherever they are, they will find their own sort of normal white balance point for the environment they're in. So essentially we have a very good automatic white balance system built into our brains. That's fine, but we need to be absolutely certain that a color that we see on the screen in front of us is going to appear the same, or would appear the same somewhere else in the same conditions. And I know there's huge question marks there about, but are people watching this stuff in the same conditions? That's irrelevant. That's completely irrelevant. It's about adhering to a standard, making sure that everyone adheres to that same standard, and then it's up to the end user to decide whether or not they want to also adhere to that standard or not. All we can do is make sure that we're ticking the right boxes. So if a color viewed on my screen here appears a certain way to me, that appearance of that color is based on how my brain has kind of normalized the white point of the environment I'm in. So as you can imagine, therefore, if we have mixed light sources coming in, our brain would be constantly sort of moving from one to the other. And so the colors on the screen would be permanently shifting slightly from one place to the other. What you ideally want to do then is you want to create an environment where you've got no mixed lighting coming in, so you've got no light sources from anywhere else. So for example, here we have blackout blinds on the what I'm sure would be lovely big windows that we never get to see out. They're permanently blacked out, and they mean that no daylight comes in at all, because daylight's lovely and it's nice to kind of balance out sometimes. So we take regular breaks and just walk outside and let our eyes kind of settle to sort of the average kind of daylight that's going on outside. And that's no bad thing, because our end viewer is probably going to be looking similar environment. But it's always important that when we come back into the grading suite that we close that light out and we go back to our controlled lighting. So blackout blinds on any windows, make sure there's no natural light coming in whatsoever. And then the light source that you have inside, it's important that that's of a certain color and a certain intensity. So from the color side of things, you want the light sources in your color grading suite to be the same white, the same color white as the white point of your monitor. And thankfully, the white point of monitors, if configured and calibrated for Rec 709, should always be 6,500 Kelvin or 6,504. It's a very specific white point that is specified as part of the Rec 709 standard and is often abbreviated to D65. And so that white value then tells us exactly what color the light should be. They should also be that 6,500 Kelvin, because if they're not, what I just said would happen. You'll see a color on here and our brain will tune for that. And then you look into the ambient room and then your brain will tune for that and that color will change. So there needs to be harmony amongst those. So getting hold of 6,500 daylight balanced lights is fairly easy now. It's certainly a hell of a lot easier than it used to be. You can literally just buy them off eBay. I think I've got, here we go, it's just behind me here. Let me unscrew it. So you can, this is a 6,500 Kelvin daylight LED from Amazon. It was a couple of quid, and it's actually in like a diffusion glass thing. Actually, I don't really ever use these, but I bought them for the Mastering Color course when we were filming as a kind of an example of how you might kind of do this on the cheap. What's the downside of these lights is they're never particularly high CRI or TLCI, which is the measurement of their color rendering index and measurement of their color accuracy. It's all very well buying a light that says I'm 6,500 Kelvin, but if it can't sustain that, or if it varies over time, or if there are big sort of chunks missing from the spectrum, from the output from the light, then it's not ideal. And this is where we get into a bit of a grey area, because I'm sure that there may be people sat there watching this thinking, making down a list of absolutely everything, and their intent is to create a color grading suite that's just for color grading, and they've got limitless resources. But I imagine that if there is anyone in that position, there's probably only a couple of them. I imagine most people are probably editors, maybe DOPs who just want to see their stuff properly, and really you're on a budget and you're wanting to create more of a mixed use environment. So this is where you can take some things as kind of with a pinch of salt. It's better to have a lower TLCI, kind of, I think those ones are something like 88 or something, which, really usually they should be at least 90 or much higher. The ones we actually use are 97. The idea is you want to as accurate as light as possible, but they're really expensive and they're a couple of quid. So I think you need to kind of, to look at what your certain circumstances are and make that decision for yourself. I've got these ones I've also put in like a diffuse glass, so it kind of diffuses the light, so it's not a direct point. You don't want bright point light sources in your field of vision when you're color grading. So the idea is that they're behind you, or they're to the sides, or they're low and they're out of sight, and they're just filling the room with an ambient 6,500 Kelvin light, which will maintain that white balance as you're looking around. So cut out all exterior light, mixed lighting, turn off obviously any tungsten lights or overhead office lights. We've got some nasty typical overhead fluoros in this office here, but they're always off, to be honest, because they're horrible. And make sure you can control that light. The next thing to do is to make sure that there are no bright colors, so no bright materials in your field of vision, or certainly occupying too much of your field of vision, and in particular behind your reference monitor. And the way you do that is you paint your walls. Again, you can do this sort of on the cheap, or you can do this properly. There's actually not that much difference in price between doing it properly and doing it on the cheap. I do know people who just paint their walls white or paint their walls grey. But really you should use a proper pigment-free paint. If you go into Homebase or B&Q or something and watch someone mixing up a grey paint, you'll see it'll take a white base and it'll squirt lots of colours into it and then mix it up. And it's like, well, how do you get grey from colours? What we're trying to do in a CMYK system, you can do that, but it's, when it actually comes down to it, there are colour pigments in that surface. And strictly speaking, we want pigment-free, like a white balance card. We don't want light hitting our 6500 Kelvin light, hitting that surface, pigments in that paint, taking out certain frequencies and then it bouncing back, because that essentially is tinting the light as it reflects back to us. Again, we're talking like proper, so it's up to you. What we do is we have a paint here that's made by a company called GTI, which I believe you can get in the UK through a company called Colour Confidence. I don't know, Jake, please correct me if you guys sell it as well. I think it's very specialist.
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Sorry?
I don't think we do, no.
Okay, fine. I thought you said we do, and I'm like,
I mean, we can sell anything. We can get hold of anything, pretty much. So.
We'll get you anything. Leave that there. So, yeah, anyway, it's made by GTI, and just Google it. I'm sure you'll find somewhere. It's very expensive. It's a very small tin. It's about 150 quid for a small 5-litre tin, I think, or it may even be less than 5 litres. But it's very thin, and it actually goes a really long way. So we painted the whole of this grading suite with half a tin. So it actually goes quite a long way, and I think it's worth paying the extra money. It's a clear base that's mixed with graphite, so it's properly pigment free. It's the same way that they make white balance cards, and we've painted all the walls here. Depending on where you are, you might be in your spare room, you might be in a home office, you might be in a shared like co-working space. You need to obviously check that you're able to paint the walls depending on where you are. If you can't, then there are other things you can do. So in my Master in Colour course, I actually demonstrate getting a big I think it was like an 8x4 polyboard, and they sell them often. I know they do at the rental houses near me in Bristol. They will sell discards, so that the ones that have been come back, maybe they've got a little chip on them or something, or a mark on them, which you don't really care about for what we're talking about, or they might be scuffed up, and they sell them for a couple of quid, and they're big but light, and they're very easy to just sort of maybe slip on a desk, just sit on a desk and slip behind a monitor, or even you could stick them with double-sided tape. They're so light, if you put enough of it on, you could just stick it to the wall. Very simple surface then to just paint and put behind your monitor. Obviously, if you can paint the walls, ideal. Funnily enough, in our studio here, we weren't allowed to paint the walls. You can see there's brick behind me, and that's fine because it's behind me. I'm not looking at it. As long as it's not in my field of vision, that's fine. It's all blacked out over here. And then on the walls around us, which we weren't allowed to paint, there's chipboard. And even though it's just chipboard, they wouldn't let us paint it. So we had to actually meticulously go around. I bought 2 massive rolls of 2-meter wide canvas from an art supply store. And we cut it to size, to all of these different panel sizes of the chipboard, and we meticulously unscrewed each screw that held the chipboard in place, and then re-screwed it and stretched the canvas over it, and then painted the canvas with this paint. So when if we ever leave this space, we can literally just unscrew it, take it down, and it'll be back to how it was. So sometimes you have to get creative, but again, it didn't cost us anything. It was just, well, it did. The cost of the canvas was maybe 100 quid or something, but the time is the big thing, and whether or not you can invest that time. So it's an important part of kind of neutralizing your environment, helping your eyes stay neutral, and the overall level of illumination you want in the room. You want your lights to not be really bright and dominant. You don't want them in your field of vision. You want just kind of a general ambient light that's roughly, and again, take this with a pinch of salt, roughly 10% as bright as your monitor, your reference monitor, when your reference monitor is displaying pure white at 100 nits, which is gamma 2.4, Rec 709, standard kind of for Rec 709 broadcast work. You could measure that. You could literally measure that with a light meter and try and sort that out, or you could just kind of get it roughly right. All of those things together kind of are a proper color grading suite setup. You can sort of borrow and steal bits and pieces from that and make use of it if you think it's relevant to you and achievable. But that's kind of the ideal that we're trying to hit. The next thing to talk about is the kind of the workflow of color grading. So I'm actually going to cut to DaVinci Resolve. Again, I'm using Resolve, but this applies to whether you're using Premiere to grade or Final Cut or any tool, basically any color tool that you're using. The workflow that I'm going to discuss here is the important thing. So I'm actually going to cut to my my Resolve interface. If you just bear with me 2 seconds. Jake, you've disabled screen sharing. Could you just enable it for me, please?
2 seconds.
And can you tell me where you enable it? Because I had this happen to me the other day and I couldn't.
Down the bottom where it says share screen and like the bottom tab, you press the little arrow and then you can share and then all panelists and then boom, you should be able to do it.
Yeah, no, but I mean, you're from your side as you've disabled it and you're now enabling it for me.
Right, okay. Yeah, it should be there. It should be the little arrow there. You can do only host. Yeah.
Weird. I tried to do it for someone the other day. I was doing some one-to-one training and he wanted to share his screen with me and I couldn't figure out how to let him do it. Right. Okay. So hopefully now you can all see my interface. Let me come over here and I'm just going to reset the grade on this particular shot. So if I also cut to this, you should now be able to see the output from my Ultra Studio 4K Mini. So we're using Blackmagic's little breakout box here. It's actually a really useful little box. We used to have to do this with a huge, in fact, in mastering color, I'm using the way you used to have to do this a year or so ago, which was the Ultra Studio Extreme. What's the full name of it? The Ultra Studio 4K Extreme, is it? I think the big one.
Ollie, what was the book called that you referred to? The Colorist, is it Colorist Handbook?
Oh, it's called the Colorist's Handbook by, spelt the American way, Colorist's Handbook by Alexis van Herkman. Yeah, really good book. Just be aware that a lot of, all of it is based on, specifications and technologies that existed when the book was written, which was, I think, 10 plus years ago now. I can't remember how old it is. So just bear that in mind. I think there's because it concentrates on workflow, it's still very relevant. But just bear that in mind. You might prefer to watch my Mastering Color course instead. It's probably about the same amount of money. So yeah, it's older. It's still a current product. The big daddy, the Blackmagic Ultra Studio 4K Extreme, has loads of different outputs on it. And I think in Mastering Color, I was using one of the reference monitors it's got 3G SDI in it. So you needed 4 SDI cables in order to power it for HDR 4K. Thankfully, that's changed now, and I'm now using a much cheaper, much smaller box. This is the Ultra Studio 4K Mini, which is about 450 quid, I think, ex-VAT, roughly, something like that. And it's awesome because it's Thunderbolt 3, comes out of our Mac Pro, and it will actually give us 4K HDR over HDMI and 12 gig SDI. So it's a really, really valuable little small box, much, much easier to power and to have on a desk. So that feed that you're getting now is, as well as my desktop being shared, or my interface being shared, that feed is coming directly from the output. And that's quite an important point in terms of setup and hardware for your studio, because this is being fed a clean, high quality output from the system. So I do see people who will just get a second monitor and they'll just share their viewer. So there is, in the workspace here, there is a dual screen layout. that is not the same as having a clean output from the system. So if you want maximum options, then use a hardware box to do that. So like I said, the 4K Extreme Mini is useful. It's Thunderbolt 3. There is now in Resolve 16 an output, an option to send out a clean output from the screen. So where's it gone? That's weird. Even my memory is failing me, or it's not showing it to me for some reason. Or maybe they've moved it because they like to move things quite frequently. I'm sure it's normally here. Maybe my brain's gone funny. It is very hot today, but it should normally be an option to do a clean feed output. Actually, I know why it is. It's because I've got my second monitor switched off. I'm being stupid. So when you've got your second monitor turned on, it displays that option to you. That's new. That will actually enable you to send a clean feed, your viewer essentially straight off from the graphics card, straight out as a clean feed, as a reference, without the need for Blackmagic's hardware, which is actually a huge change that they implemented relatively recently. So what we do now, in fact, we were talking about this just before we went live. My new reference monitor, we've just got a new reference monitor here, which is HDMI. There's only one HDMI output on the Ultra Studio, so that's now feeding my reference monitor, which means my HDMI client monitor, which used to take that feed, is now unable to be hooked up to the Ultra Studio, but we can hook it straight into the HDMI output on the Mac Pro, and we'll be able to use the clean feed option to essentially feed our client monitor with a unbiased, high quality clean feed straight off the graphics card. So it is important that you do one of those options to be able to see this, and so that's what you're being fed right now from the Ultra Studio, which I've just got the HDMI output going into my ATA Mini Pro, so I can cut to that, which is quite useful. Okay, so here we've got an ungraded frame from, this is the same stuff I think I showed you last week or the week before. This is from a spec commercial for Pucker for their organic latte range. And I've just realized that my control surface is not connected. So let me just unplug it and plug it back in again. 2 seconds. Always a bit tricky because it's stuck behind a, no, actually I can move that now, can't I? In again. Work first time, go on. It's weird. Almost always needs to be unplugged and plugged back in again twice in quick succession before it will recognize it. There we go. Two's a charm. Right. My I'm using the control surface here. This is the Blackmagic. I should be on commission for Blackmagic, Christ. I'm not, but I should be. This is the Blackmagic mini control surface. So they do two, well, they do three, but the ones that are in the realms of mere mortals, they do the mini and the micro. The micro, I've actually got the micro as well. The micro is great for traveling because it's powered just off the USB-C input on it. So there's no separate power supply. So it's really, really useful if you're with a laptop, you're on the move. Last September, I should probably flip back to this because you're staring at nothing at the moment. Last September, I graded the sizzle reel for the launch of Canon's C500 Mark II. And they had this, we did an HDR sizzle reel with the BTS stuff that Brett shot and the footage that he got back. And I was editing that on the train on the way. It was very last minute. So I got the rushes like the day that I was leaving to go to Amsterdam. So I was editing it on the Eurostar on the way to Amsterdam on my laptop. And then when I got to my hotel, Canon had already sent ahead in advance their new 2000 nit HDR reference monitor, the 32-inch. And I had brought with me the 4K Ultra Studio 4K, the mini version that I've just talked about, and my micro panel and my MacBook Pro that I had at the time, the 15-inch. Yeah, there's, I mean, it's been out there a while now. You've probably seen the BTS and stuff, but it's all just set up on a desk in my hotel room and did the 2000 nit grade. I was working on it until 4 o'clock in the morning because I had to do multiple. I had to do 1000 nit, a 2000 nit, an SDR, And then there were 2 different versions of the edit, so it ended up being 8 deliverables, which I had to do before the next day when we were on Canon's stand with it. In their little, they had it on screens on the stand, and they had a little theatre out the back, an HDR projector that they were showing it on. So we had to have it all ready. I think I was working on it till 4 o'clock in the morning. But the micro panel was really useful then, because we didn't need so many additional power supplies to bring with it, which is great. I'm using the mini one at the moment, so that's got the additional little screen at the top, which or 2 screens, which gives you additional controls. You can add power windows with a press of a button. You can get access to all of the secondary tools. So essentially the bottom section, which you have only have that section on the micro, is for mainly primary controls, which I'm going to talk about the distinction between those in a sec. And then on the mini, you've got the additional section at the top, which is predominantly secondary related tools. So your power windows, your curves, your qualifiers and such like. Right, let's come back to here. So let's talk about workflow. The first thing to bear in mind is that you always want to deal with contrast first. We're far more sensitive to contrast than we are. Hang on, let me just reset this. Sorry, we're far more sensitive to contrast than we are color. So our luminance perception is incredibly good, and we can see a contrast ratio at any one time of 10,000 to 1. We're very, very sensitive to subtle changes in contrast, and actually relatively low color acuity. So we want to always prioritize contrast above all else. So pushing contrast into an image is almost always going to be the first thing that you're going to do. When we're color grading, we want to kind of work on an idea of doing very subtle, not very subtle, that's not necessarily the right word, but very gentle steps early on. So for example, I wouldn't, if I turn on my extents here, so there's a feature in Resolve now, you've got this extents feature, which will actually show you where the kind of the bottom reaches of your signal and the top uppermost reaches of your signal are. And that is quite useful in this early stage, because you can make sure that you're not losing any information too early on, basically too early on in the process. And the reason for that is you don't want to have to struggle to recover details later on. You want to work towards the most extreme look that you might end up with. It might be that you don't end up with an extreme look at all, but if you are going to push it quite far, particularly from like a creative look point of view at the end, you don't want to go too far too soon. So we're always being quite gentle sort of at these early stages. And a primary grade simply means a grade that is affecting the entire image. So like we've got here, we've got this whole frame is now changing from one state to another, from this kind of log flat image to the graded image. This particular shot was recorded, let me just double check. So this cinema raw light, and it's 50 frames, yeah, 50 frames per second, 10 bits, 4K DCI, and this is Canon's cinema raw light from the C200. Which is an incredibly robust codec. It's absolutely fantastic. And so I can do quite a lot with it. Because it's raw, actually, I could come into the raw parameters and I could develop from there, but I'm quite happy just to use the presets for now. It's an incredibly high quality codec anyway, and I'm not pushing it very far, so I don't feel like I really need to use those raw controls right now. All I'm doing really is I'm just thinking about balancing out the darkest parts of the image and the brightest parts of the image. Now, this is quite tricky when you're working with something that doesn't have anything explicitly black or explicitly white in it. If you do, it's much, much easier. Let me give you another example of, let me see if I can find this. I've got a little demo shot that I use quite often, actually, which I'll just stick in here quickly. And just trim this down. Let's go from there to, just grab a little section of it there. So this is another interesting one. So I've actually jumped to the most difficult ones. If you have a chart, here you go, look, there's a big chart. This is actually the chart shot that I used for my talking head that I recorded to go with my C300 first look film. So this is actually in here from when I was grading that. So we use these charts on all of our interviews and as much of our other shots as we can, although just depends on how quickly you're trying to turn around. But we use these on all of our interviews. And the reason we use them is exactly what I'm talking about here. If you're trying to balance out a shot that hasn't got anything black or white in it, it's obviously a lot more difficult than if you do. So the first kind of stage in a primary grade is really pinning that black and that white point. And it has to be a true black and a true white. And in this image, although there are some true blacks, they represent such a small part of the frame. They're very difficult to see. And there's nothing white. I mean, the white of her eye, I'd be surprised unless she had like lights inside her skull. I doubt very much that these would ever be anything like that. So you have to think realistically about where white would be sitting. And if you don't have that, this is why charts are so useful, because obviously they have a white and they have a black. That white is specifically 90, and this black is obviously should be 0 if it's glossy and got no reflections on it. So those are very easy to see, and it's very easy to kind of balance that out in an image. And so what I'm using here are kind of tricky shots, because there's nothing, there's a little bit of black, but nothing white in this. And here there's nothing black or true black, and also there's nothing true white, but we do have something that's clipped, which essentially then supersedes the fact that you're looking for something white. In this shot, we're facing directly into the sun. It's harsh sunlight. We've got a little bit of clipping up here, a little bit of clipping just where it's hitting the top of this this person's leg, and you can see that clipping in the waveform. It's that flat top there. So actually, these are both tricky shots, because in terms of pinning black and white, you know, there's nothing true black, there's nothing true white. Well, the clipping point essentially now replaces our true white, and so that essentially supersedes that. So we're going to leave that there. And then as for the black point, if I bring the blacks down on this image, the biggest mistake you can make is just say, well, look, the darkest thing in the frame, which is actually this moss on this rock over here, the darkest thing in this frame, put that at black. You know, that's the worst thing you can do. It has to be something that's actually black that ends up down there. If it's not actually black and you put it at 0, you're going to be losing data in something that you should see detail in. So this moss is actually has got a really beautiful texture to it, so we wouldn't want to place that down at black, because that's just going to go. So I'd have that just slightly above. Our clipping point essentially determines the top, and then we're using our mids or our gamma. So I'm using my gamma master wheel to then sort of shift the weight of the image one way or the other. This is meant to be quite a moody, low contrast, and well, not necessarily low contrast, but sort of low brightness image. So I'm actually using my gamma to bring that down, but maintaining this detail in these shadows here. My clipping point is essentially set that. So similarly here, we've got we've essentially got our balanced image in the same way that we have with this one, ungraded, and then just simple contrast. You can see this is one node. It's not just one node. It's just gain master wheel, lift master wheel, and gamma in this case, gamma in these two clips as well. So this is what I mean about contrast. It makes a major difference to our perception of the image. I would normally then follow up with actually a separate round of contrast, or if I was, you know, in a bit of a hurry, I might do it on the same node, where I'd also then look at my contrast. And there are actually dedicated contrast and pivot controls in Resolve, but you know, it doesn't matter what software you're using. You might be using curves, in which case you might choose to do it down here. What we're talking about here is we're just kind of pushing in, brightening the highlights. Let me do a stupid amount just to make it obvious, and darkening the shadows. So we're actually creating, you know, that kind of S shape that we normally associate with high contrast, where we're bunching up. And the important thing is our white point is still fixed and our black point is still fixed. I actually like to do this as a first port of call with the contrast and pivot controls, because they're very quick. I can push in the contrast that I think I want, and I can then adjust my pivot to actually move that up or down. So you can see my shadows are either moving up or down, and I'm essentially changing the pivot point. If this was an S curve, I'm changing the pivot point either down or up, sort of changing the point where it's most interesting. And then if I create a new node and push some saturation into this image, again, just an arbitrary amount, then you quickly see that we're moving an awfully long way from where we started. But that color sort of comes relatively late in the game. It's really the contrast is the big thing. That's the big thing that we need to worry about. As a primary step, we're making these gentle kind of moves in the right direction. You know, I might actually sort of possibly take out some of that contrast because I'm just losing a bit of detail there. And we're just trying to kind of gently move. So each time we're moving on through a different step, we're getting sort of more aggressive. Now, one of the other things that I might do, which actually I'm going to do as a parallel node here, which is just an adjustment that's happening at the same point in the image processing chain. Sometimes you need to do this because literally the result that you want isn't possible without this. Sometimes you do this just because organizationally it looks, it's a good way of organizing things to kind of group them together. So in this case, I'm actually using this just to represent two major contrast adjustments in one, and then I'm separating off my chroma, my saturation, and other color adjustments over here. In fact, I'll do another one over here. So you can even label them to make it much easier. So this is my sat. I'm actually going to do a tint adjustment in that one. This is my main balance, which I've spelt wrong here, balance. And this one here, I'm actually just going to do, this is actually going to be a secondary, but it's going to help with the overall contrast balance. So I'm just going to call this one gradient. And the reason I'm going to do this is I'm going to slightly fix something that's happening with this image. It's very hard to see, but the left-hand side of the frame is grayer, is the black point is higher than on the right-hand side. You can see that in the waveform. The right-hand side is kind of right down, just above black, and then the left-hand side is slightly elevated. The reason for that is the camera is facing into the sun, and so I've got just a tiny little bit of lens flare. So that lens flare is actually just raising the black level on the left-hand side of the frame. You can actually see it shifting as she moves in and out of the frame. And later on, she gets up and walks through that, and you suddenly see this side drops. And just to slightly counteract that, and this is really about aiding composition, I'm actually going to just bring down the black point on this left-hand side and have it fading off so it doesn't affect the other side. And that's where windows come in incredibly usefully. So I'm going to come to my Windows menu here. This is my gradient window. I'm just going to apply that gradient. And if I use the highlight mode, which is this little wand here, it shows me where that transitionary point is coming from, where that transition is coming from. So the gray is going to be protected from any changes. And then where I see the image, that's not protected. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have that fading off. Let's turn that highlight mode, turn that highlight mode off. And then I'm just going to bring down, I'm just looking at the left-hand side of the scopes here. I'm just bringing them down until they meet more or less the same level. So this whole image, you know, the compositionally, it's been shot to try and use the symmetry of the scene. You've got the path running up the middle. You've got the banks on either side. This is actually an old disused ironworks, and then our subject matter is just slightly to the side of the central point. So the symmetry of this framing is important, and by losing that symmetry, you lose some of the impact of the framing. And actually, it's a subtle thing, but we're just bringing that down on the left-hand side just to actually make it work as a more kind of interesting way of leading that eye and supporting the symmetry. And I think this is where color grading and particularly secondary adjustments are so vital to the process of supporting what you're actually seeing on screen. It's not just about fixing things, and it certainly shouldn't be. It's also about aiding. So I mean, I shot this, so I know what my intent was with the framing, but trying to aid framing where the eye is ending up. You know, these areas of high contrast are drawing the eye down the middle, and now with a balanced and equal amount of sort of blacks on either side here, that's just helping us channel our vision down to where we want it to go, which is this area here. We could even support that further by adding another one, you know, maybe doing a slight sort of power window in the middle, just fading it off, and just maybe pushing a little bit of extra contrast, just a little bit more extra contrast into the middle, just to kind of sort of support that. Let's bring that off. Just to, again, just kind of bring us as much as possible down into the middle here. We could then even invert that. We can use what's known as an outside node. an outside node takes the alpha channel, which is this blue connection, and it inverts it in the next one. So I could even, you know, maybe desaturate the outside, or lower the blacks even further, just to kind of, you know, again, trying to bring the eye down here. I don't want to kind of lose too much black information, so maybe lowering the saturation is quite a nice way of just feeding in, because high saturation will also lead the eye. So we can maybe push the saturation up a bit more in the middle. And you can start to see how these secondary adjustments, they actually start making quite a big difference to our perception of the image overall, from our starting point to kind of where we're going. We've pushed the saturation up sort of uniformly here as a primary adjustment, and then here I'm actually just going to push a little bit of magenta. So part of our primary work is also correcting color tints. Now, the white balance of this image was set correctly, but there's so much green here, and the light is bouncing off of these surfaces. It's actually tinting the skin, and the skin has a slightly nasty kind of limey green appearance to it. There's two ways that people might try to tackle this. And this is a top tip. If you've got something that's very high quality, then by all means try and qualify that selection and key that skin and then adjust it separately. But if you have something that's, you know, like this was shot on an original A7S, is a very old clip from a very long time ago. This is an 8-bit 420 codec, and it really, I already know, because I've tried it before and I've demonstrated this before, but even if I didn't, I would already kind of think of looking at different approaches, because this image would start falling to pieces if I try and key it. There's too many similarities, particularly between the rocks and the soil on the ground and the colors that we're trying to key out of here. So actually what's a much better approach is to look at the curves. So we have hue versus hue curves, and there's actually a preset here for green. And if I start adjusting that, I can start adjusting the colors that fall within that particular region. This is where the vector scope is very useful. So I come down into my vector scope, and let's just zoom in, get my skin tone indicator on. I can, let's come over here, yeah. So I can actually see, so it's actually mainly in the yellows. So if I just come into the yellows, there's a couple of different ways I can go with that. If I just push those just round ever so slightly, and the greens round a little bit more, and then I'm just going to come to my gamma and just push a tiny bit of magenta into the midtones of the image. Now, it doesn't look like much. If I turn that on and off, it's not a huge difference, but it's actually just enough to bring her skin tones, which are falling too far to the left here, to actually further more round towards red. And it's enough to not ruin the kind of the rest of the image. If I felt like that was making too much of an impact on these more saturated greens, then what I could do, and this works quite well as a kind of like a look at the end of the chain. Let's actually turn my open effects window off so you can see this a bit better. If we call this like a look, and let's say that, you know, this is like a horror film, and we wanted it to feel a little bit creepy. Another thing that we could do actually is we can actually target these specific greens. So if I just click on these greens, that gives me that selection there, and I can actually adjust these foliage colors round without affecting the skin. It's the type of thing that one would predict that you would need to use a qualifier for. You would want to come into here to make these kind of extreme adjustments. But with something that's low quality, and if you don't need like a really, really perfect key, or you don't have time, so here you can see how quickly this has happened, actually you'll find that these hue versus hue curves are a really good way. Like if I do like a really extreme adjustment, you can see that has done a really good job of targeting just the foliage and pretty much leaving her alone entirely. If I wanted a really extreme adjustment, then keys become more, you become more reliant on them. But if I'm just doing just a subtle adjustment, you know, I might want to go this way and kind of make it look slightly weird, like she's like on another planet. Or in this case, I just want to take some of the life and vibrancy out of that, make it look a little bit more sort of menacing. Or we could push it up and maybe look at a bit sort of more autumnal or something, you know, and that actually is moved a hell of a long way from where we started. Doesn't require any windows, so I don't need to worry about tracking anything. You know, we've got her skin looking pretty good due to the tint that we did here. So that's just taking out that green from her skin. We've got the overall level of saturation. We've got that look there at the end. We've got our overall balance. We've got the gradient bringing down the left-hand side. And we've got these two here that are just helping bring our attention into the middle of the frame. So a relatively quick grade. So it actually works really well. So what we're doing there is we're kind of breaking down that process then into primary corrections and secondary corrections, focusing on our contrast first and then our colors second. If we go back to this shot, there's also separate things that we can think about in terms of specifically in terms of skin. So let's just talk about skin for a minute. Take a sip of water, hang on. So when we're grading skin tones, at the moment I've just done a contrast adjustment on this and nothing else. If we look at our vector scope, we can see clearly the adjustment that we've made. We've pushed in saturation. In terms of saturation of skin, this skin here, she's obviously Caucasian. The saturation level of skin, it gets slightly more saturated the more melanin there is, so that the darker their skin is. So if you look at the ethnicity of the skin tone that you're dealing with, it will kind of slightly guide you on as to how saturated you want it in terms of creating neutrality. If I push that up too high, that I could get away with maybe that level of saturation if this was very dark, sort of black African skin. But with Caucasian skin, it just doesn't. It's too saturated. It's too high. And typically, you would want your sort of skin, if it's looking sort of normal and this kind of pigment as well, you would probably normally want this to be roughly 30 to 35% on your vector scope. So my vector scope is currently at 2x zoom. If I turn that off, so this is 100% out here, 0% here, 50% here. So we're at roughly sort of 30, 35%. This is why the 2x zoom being on is very useful. That's kind of a normal-ish, what is normal, but you get my meaning. This is kind of a typically what we'd expect level of saturation for the skin tone that we've been presented with. And in terms of brightness, again, there's nothing white or black in this image, but I do know that a brightly illuminated sort of key side of a face with Caucasian skin would normally hit around about 70 to 75 IRE. We don't have any bright key here. There is some light that she's actually looking into here, which I mean, this is probably the wrong course to talk about this, but if you look carefully, let me get my other mouse in. If we look carefully at the eye here, you can see it's a window. So you've got this reflection in the eye, and this is a window-shaped catch light in the eyes. This is actually a trace frame with a couple, I think, of light panels, Gemini's 2x1s, and the trace frame we've put black gaff tape across in this pattern. So we've gone one down and a two across to actually make this look like it's a window, because we needed it to match a wide shot that we see when our lighting's not in the frame. So actually all of that I've done artificially to kind of create sort of like a homely look for this particular catch light, but that's not actually there. But this light is quite soft, so we probably don't want it too high. So actually the bulk of her skin is sitting just a little bit lower. But if you had a bright sort of key light from like a typical kind of like journalistic type interview or something, and you were looking for a guide, how bright should the skin be? Caucasian skin tends to be on that key side up around the 70 IRE, and then obviously it drops as the ethnicity changes. You get darker skin, that's going to drop down. And with really deep black African skin, you could be really sort of down in these sorts of areas, sort of 25 IRE. So there's quite a big range depending on the ethnicity of the subject matter. But skin tones can, in the absence of a true black or true white kind of reference when you're setting your contrast, they can be a bit of a guide to help you get broadly in the right place in terms of brightness and saturation. The other thing to bear in mind with skin tone is there is, if we go back to my vector scope, there is this kind of idea of expected skin tones, and this is where kind of science and creativity clash to a certain extent. from a scientific point of view, that the color of melanin and the color of hemoglobin in your blood, and the translucency of the fat layer under your skin, they all basically mean that universally, no matter your ethnicity, you should have a pretty uniform color. Now, that will change based on whether or not you've just run a marathon, or if it's a hot day or a cold day, or how much fat covering they've got. If they've got thicker fat covering under their skin, then there's going to be more of that kind of reflective, translucent fat layer, which is colorless. But it's also going to be meaning that less of those deeper red tones are going to come through. So those people might end up with more yellowy skin tone. So this flesh tone line is very much a guide, but it is surprising how closely skin tone should fall to it. And if we look here, we've actually got 3 blobs. So we've got this blob here, which is actually the wall, which is more yellow and less saturated. We've got this big blob here, which is the bulk of her skin. And then we've got this blob here, which is actually her lips and with her lipstick. And you can see that actually the bulk of her skin is actually falling quite far over to the yellow side. If I were to just push that so that her skin is actually, this main blob here is actually mainly sort of balanced on that line. It's kind of falling either side. It's only a small adjustment. I don't want to do too much, but that actually is now technically in a better place. And if we turn it off and on again, we actually realize that it was quite yellow. And our eyes do get used to looking at something. We neutralize things out. So the more we look at it when it's in inverted commas wrong, the more kind of normal it looks. So we're actually just pulling that across and taking away some of that yellow color, and actually that's a much more neutral, accurate pigment that we've got there, and that pushes the lipstick more towards red, and we've got that separation there. What I can do if I wanted to really make her skin tone stand out, and you do get this, excuse me, excuse me, you do get this a lot from clients. I mean, it's probably the most commented thing we get when we're dealing with talent is, can you make the skin pop? Can you make them stand out more? And the wrong way to do that is to go, let me do this as another note. The wrong way to do that would be like, oh, okay, and just whack the saturation up. I had a grade I was doing once for a good friend of mine who had DP'd it. He brought me in, and the client, I'm not going to name names, but the client wanted the talent to stand out. And this talent is a very well-known celebrity in the UK. And they wanted her to stand out more. And they wanted it to look more like a summer's day. And I was like, well, okay, but I'll do my best. But they had shot on a slightly kind of day, a little bit sort of overcast. I think it was a bit early in the morning. This particular shot that really caused problems, where they were down a side street in Chelsea, I think they were filming it, and it had all these really nicely kind of coloured houses in the background, and they had chosen a part of the street where actually mainly the kind of houses were quite kind of grey and blues and were cooler colours. I think there was one house that was like a light yellow. There was no direct sun on the talent, and they said, we want this to really pop, and it kept basically by the end of it, the saturation was kind of like this, and I was like, and they were like, oh, we need more, and I was literally going insane. One of the safest ways to actually get skin to appear to be relatively more saturated is to actually to pull back the saturation of things that are around that subject. So if we kind of say, well, this is our actual skin, this is where we kind of want our skin, and then with this one, what we could do is we could attempt, see how easy it's going to be, we could attempt to try and isolate as much as we can just that lower part. So we've got this lower saturation part here, and in fact it's not. Let's just grab this. I'm just going to very slowly drag my input hue across. Hang on. And what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at the vector scope. This is very tricky, but if you just look at this little blob here, this is the blob. Can you see my cursor? Actually, I don't know. Sometimes the software hides the cursor, in which case you have no idea.
You can, mate. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, so this little small blob here, this is the wall. It's the lower saturated, but almost the same color. So what I can do is if I select this enclosing, this is the main selection for the wall, and this is the enclosing selection. Let's get rid of that one. And I'm just going to very slowly hot scrub the input hue left to increase the selection range. But I'm watching here because I don't want it to start eating away at her skin. If I go too far, it's going to start eating away at her skin. So if I go somewhere about there, that's actually pulling away a fair amount of saturation from the wall, and therefore, by contrast, her skin now looks more saturated, rather than me just pushing up the saturation across the whole image or just pushing up her skin to a point where it looks wrong. So we're going from here to here. The other thing that we can do is, actually, maybe I should label this so you can keep up. Balance, sat, and then this is wall desat. And another thing that we need to think about, so I'm actually fairly happy with her skin. The makeup artist that we had on this shoot was really good. I'm pretty happy with the tone of her skin. If you ever have someone who's got very, maybe they're hot, or maybe they've got high blood pressure, or maybe that's just their natural pigment, you sometimes get people who have very pink cheeks and foreheads, and those classically are the areas that do go pink because they're where the capillaries are nearer the surface. So cheeks, noses, and foreheads, middle of forehead, so where you tend to get the colors that are falling on this side of the skin tone line. And then these darker areas, so around the back, sort of by the back of the cheeks and under the neck and so on. Hang on, let me cut to my other camera. so I'm talking about here. So, and in the neck and in the back of the jowl and at the back and the side of the head, these areas are all quite yellow and quite this sort of nice melanin ochre color. And that's because the melanin comes forwards, because the red from the hemoglobin is further back. And by that, I mean there's more fat in these areas. And so the blood vessels are further under the skin. And so you don't notice that red so much, but they're very near the surface. So on these cheeks and foreheads, you get more pinkiness. Now that's perfectly normal, and I think that's been handled very well by our makeup artist here, and that blend looks really nice. However, if you were trying to grade someone who didn't have the benefit of a makeup artist kind of looking after them, or if their pigment's just too extreme, then you can start kind of narrowing that gap. And this is where we start to get into slightly dodgy territory as to kind of like, well, you're now dictating what normal looks like. But everyone, if you look at any cover art, any photography, any talent, there is a sort of an established aesthetic and a kind of a way of approaching skin tones that we're all kind of permanently bombarded with in terms of receiving this visual information. And so there's a certain expectation of what good or kind of perfect skin tone looks like, and it's not the color by any stretch of the imagination. What it is it's the variation in color. That's the thing that ideally you want to kind of give it that kind of classic look. And one of the ways that you can do it, there's two kind of main ways. One of the ways that I used to do it was to use the hue versus hue and just isolate. So if I click here on her cheek, I'll get a more pinky color. And if I click here on her skin, you can see that selection's further towards yellow. And what you would do is you would try and kind of tweak those two areas. So you'd maybe try and bring these reds further round, and you'd try and bring these yellows further round, sort of to meet in the middle. So if I look at that, I'm actually bringing the yellows further in towards red, and the reds further in towards yellow. And if you look at the overall effect on the image, it is sort of drawing out that variation. I actually think some variation is more natural, obviously, and also the sort of blushed cheeks is something that the makeup artist probably intended to do. You'd want to be guided slightly by your artistic sort of endeavors in this particular case. But that's one sort of slightly crude way that you might choose to do this. Another way would be to use the qualifier. So if we click on that part of the skin, you can see the kind of these areas which are more pinky. And if I click on the back of the skin, you can see these areas which are more ochre, which is actually the bulk of the face. So we've actually got, so what I could do, for example, is I could take these colors, and then you can see where they're falling on to the left of that scope. And then I could just use my hue rotation and actually just rotate those hues further round. And then I could do another qualifier where I was selecting just the more pinky colors. So we could try, I'm just going to take a few samples until I find it. Yeah, there you go. That's sort of just falling slightly to the right side. And I'd use my hue versus hue to actually pull that round. So that's more sort of, and so I'm doing the same thing, but but I'm just doing it with 2 separate nodes. Now, obviously, those keys are ridiculously poor, but I'm just doing it to illustrate the point. The other thing, let's just read that again, which is something that if I am going to do this, I do this more often now, is actually in the open effects. This is only in Resolve Studio, but there's the which is relevant because this was it only yesterday you were talking about the differences between Resolve Light and Resolve Studio, Jake? I think it was anyway. Jake's watching the new trailer for another film.
No, I'm not. So
was it yesterday that you were talking to Simon about the differences between Studio and?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, the color compressor is one of the cool ones that you get with Studio. If I drop that on, what I can do is I can choose a target color. So let's say, I'm doing it with an image that's actually already fine, I think. But let's say that her cheeks were too pink and the rest of her skin we had got right, but her cheeks and forehead was still too pink. What we could do is we could select the target color, which is what we're trying to make it. So if we click in this area here, and then you can then qualify the image. So if I just hang on. Let me get a selection. Let me get all of her skin this time. And let's just do this low up. I'm just going to do it very roughly because I really don't want to have to spend ages doing this. And we do something like that. So I've got her skin selected there, and then with the color compressor, I can say, well, look, this is the color that I want to target. And if I do the compress hue, you'll see, and you can see this in the vector scope really clearly as well. It's compressing and bringing everything else to match the color that I clicked on. So you can see that it's taking that kind of variation and narrowing it down. You can also compress the saturation to be more uniform, which tends to look pretty awful. But if you were finding that their cheeks were very saturated pink and the rest of their skin looked normal, then this would be great. It would bring the saturation and the color of the pinkiness back. And the compressed luminance is completely useless for this particular one, but there could be a potential use for this in a different process, but nothing to do with skin. So what you could do is kind of get it so you think you're pretty happy with it, and then just do the blend on and off and kind of say, well, look, which looks best, and settle on probably a middle point or something like that. As I said, I'm pretty happy that I don't need any of this, so I'm going to get rid of all of that. But that's another technique you could use for kind of normalizing differences between skin that's got sort of extreme differences between those pink areas and those yellow areas. Whilst we're here, though, there's also a refine effect called beauty. So if you're in a real hurry, there's actually an automatic mode here. You can drill down. There's some huge advanced modes here. But if you're in automatic in a hurry, it will automatically target skin color. And if I just ramp up the amount, it will soften. So I'm obviously doing that an extreme amount there, but it will soften off. You can also use this to sharpen and add in mid-tone detail. So bless her, Tara, I'm making her look about 20 years older than she is by doing that. But you can actually go either way, so this is also good if you've got someone who's you've got an object that's lacking detail or a face that's lacking detail, you can pull that the other way. But if I just sort of soften off some of the variation in her skin there, let's go to about sort of there, and then let's just turn it off. So I'm putting the blend on 1, and I'm just going to creep down until I start to see it, which is probably about there. Let's just turn that off and on again. And that's actually just smoothing out some of these skin. Again, there may well be people who are going to get angry about this. I'm not suggesting for a minute that her skin was wrong or bad looking the way it was. I'm just talking about, typical beauty work that's done on commercial photography and video. So don't shoot the messenger. But this is the type of thing that kind of, you might do as a final kind of beauty step to actually finish off the image at the end. So we're kind of going from here to here. And of course, like all of these grades, when you turn it all off and all on, it's just like, yeah, they've pushed up the saturation and the contrast. But actually, we can see that we've actually made some efforts to separate out the wall from the face. And we've made these additional steps with the beauty there as well to kind of refine that skin tone. So working with skin's kind of a whole skill in itself, and you know, we can use keys, we can use masks to kind of help help with that if we want to. Let's talk a little bit about continuity. So I'm going to go and grab another shot. Bear with me 2 seconds. So let's come in here. Let's let's see. This is a good example. Let's grab this and this. Let's bring these down. Oh, hello. I don't need to start my calendar. Let's come in here and we'll just append these to the timeline. Oops. There we go. We've got a really pretty dodgy slide here. Let's cut those down and let's get this to there. And let's at least 25. Can't remember. I thought we shot these 50. Yeah, we did. And let's just do this one as well. Okay. Oh, please. Sorry. Keep clicking on the wrong thing. All right. Okay. So if we take this shot, now I don't think no, I haven't. So let me just quickly balance this one out. Let's come in here. Let's pull this up. Just do a very gentle one there. So if we take a shot, let's say that we're now trying to match this shot to our next shot. If we simply just copy the grade across, that doesn't always give you exactly what you want. So if actually the whole point of this stuff is that we were shooting it so that to make the color management side of things as easy as possible. So I'm kind of hoping that there's going to be slight discrepancies here. But let's go back and see we've done too good a job. Let's say, let me just very quickly do this. There we go. Right. Oh dear, we weren't paying attention when we shot this, and look at the differences between these shots. So what we can do in terms of continuity is you're really trying to pin yourself to the subject first and foremost, but also objects in the frame that are replicated. So here, obviously, the big one is the packaging here is going. So because our eye is looking here and our eye is looking there, any differences between these two are going to be very noticeable. And if you just try and do it, if you eyeball it, which obviously if you're not set up correctly, might be, you know, and if you don't know how to read scopes, that might be the best you're going to do. It's very tricky to kind of get that just right. So the vector scopes are a very useful way of, in this case, matching the colors. You can see there's a big difference. First of all, we need to find where's this color, this yellow, and we can actually see it's this blob here. And as we jump to the next shot, we can see it's moving. So it's now further here. It's more yellowy green. Yeah. So if you couldn't see that before, that helps you. So if we try and pull that color, I'm using the hue rotation here to pull this back round. And it's so useful when they're in the same space because you can literally just go back and forth. And then the saturation, you can see it's further out, the saturation here. So I need to dial the saturation back a little bit with this shot. That looks about right. And then we've also just got this whole image is generally pushed across. You can see the blues are in the wrong place as well. So if I grab my offset for this, I'm just going to offset the whole image. I'm trying to recreate that shape. So if you're not sure, I'm looking just here. I'm not even looking at the viewer at all. I'm just looking here. I will look at the view at the end, because you always have to trust your gut instinct and your eyeballs at the end of the day. But at this point, I'm actually just going back and forth. I'm just looking at the overall shape of what I've got. And that there looks more or less the same. There we go. So in terms of neutralizing the two, this is a great way. Now, I had a really cool job come in, actually, I think it was last week, for Just Grade It, from a customer. I think they were in Florida, and they had shot a whole bunch. I can't show it, unfortunately, without, I need to check with them that they were happy for me to do that, which I haven't done, so I can't show it. But they sent me 2 minutes of various takes of a model in front of a bright orange backdrop, and she was doing various different kind of moves with her hair. So she was kind of spinning around and flipping her hair, just like I'm doing it now. The similarities are remarkable, and they've just lots and lots of different takes, and they wanted the whole thing graded for a start, but then they also wanted every single shot to match, and they even sent me a reference for what color the orange background should be, which was actually from a previously taken still that they wanted the orange to match. And using the technique I've just shown you, in combination with also using stills, so bringing up stills to actually, if I bring up, so for example, obviously this is a different shot, but if we bring up the image wipe, you know, we can compare shots to our image wipe, and we can do side-by-side comparisons. Obviously, what I'd want to do in this case, let me just bring this back up, is I would want to wipe this timeline clip instead. But, you know, there you go, doing things like this and comparing these. The other thing that you'd want to do, as well as color, is you'd also want to, sorry, I'm now not feeding you the right thing, there we go. The image wipe, the other thing that we want to do is just check that the luminance was the same. So we'd want to check that our image was sort of overall in the right kind of brightness, which actually slightly brighter. So that needed to be slightly tweaked. But using image wipes, using these techniques. So this project that we were doing for Just Grade It last week was like this, but there was about 25 different shots, and they were all very slightly different. And the talent had a white jumper on. She had obviously her skin that we needed to get right, and then there was the background. So it was relatively a relatively simple one, because there weren't kind of changes of background. The background was uniform. But using the techniques I've just shown you there, we went through all 25 of those shots, guaranteeing that the background was exactly the same brightness, exactly the same saturation, exactly the same hue across all of those 25 shots. Her skin was the same across all of those shots, and that her white top was in fact white, and again matched across all of them in terms of color, contrast, brightness, everything. So as you went from shot to shot, and at the end, you know, just I actually did a balance across the whole timeline, and then just went across in individual shots, just tweaking to balance them out. I'm literally just glued my eyes to the vector scope, gluing my eyes to the waveform monitor, which I have out on a separate monitor, so that they wouldn't be part of the interface like you can see here normally. They're on a separate 13-inch screen that I've got down here. So I can, you know, I'm literally staring at this thing, going shot to shot, and I'm just seeing if there's any subtle change as you go from each shot. And come the end, you know, it's identical. So that was then graded and sent back to them through Just Grade It's portal. They would have downloaded that graded file. They would have, I don't know, I guess they were chopping out and taking those selects for various different things. But you know, it's a really dedicated skill, continuity. It's the least kind of sexy and least showy part of color grading. And come back to what I said right at the beginning, you don't get very many people putting up YouTube videos about this sort of side of color grading. It tends to be more the showy kind of, let's make this look like this film. But that's because continuity takes a lot of time, and it's really, really it can be a real slog. And the other thing that you have to bear in mind is, as well as using these techniques, you have to use your eyes, you have to use a calibrated reference screen, you have to look at it, because sometimes things can appear to be different. So we've got a white kitchen here and a white kitchen surface, and that really helps the colors of the product look like how they're meant to be. Let's go to my other shot. That really helps the colors here look correct, for want of a better term. But the oh, hello. Turn that off. But if this work surface was a different color, even if it was like a slight yellow or a slight green or a slight anything, if it was wood colored or anything like that, it actually would have tinted our vision, or it would have made our comparative appreciation of the color of this packaging different. So you sometimes have to actually change things to be technically wrong. So the scopes actually say now these things don't match, but because visually there's an optical illusion that's taking place that's making us think that it's different. A classic one that happened to me with this was I'd graded an interview. So I'd taken all of the interview shots, put them all together, graded them. They're absolutely identical. The continuity was spot on across the whole thing. There was like 5 different interviews. They then went back where they lived in the timeline. And then when I watched it back, I think it was the second to last interview looked really pink. I thought, what's going on? So I went back in, got all of the interviews, put them side by side. They were all identical. And I realized that the shot before the shot that interview that looked pink, that previous shot was a B-roll shot of sunlight coming through trees and through the leaves. And it was just on screen long enough, just maybe 4 or 5 seconds, just long enough to weaken the green pigment in our eyes. And when you weaken, it essentially means it compensates by going in the other way. So because we've weakened green, it means that your vision then is pink. So when you see the next shot, that weakness, that weakening of the green pigment meant that the following shot appeared until my eyes had kind of balanced, which was actually too late. The interview had already come and gone. That shot looked too pink, and only because of the way our vision works, not because actually it was too pink. The signal was the same. So I ended up having to make that shot more green in order to cancel that effect of our vision. So there's all kinds of weird things that happen, and simultaneous contrast is another one where things appear different colors or different brightnesses based on what's around them. So you do need to be really careful, make sure that you actually look at the final image and not just on a calibrated screen, rather than just going by the scopes, basically. Okay, that gives us a good half an hour for Q&A if there are questions, which I hope there are. Let's come back to here. Let's stop sharing my screen. Take a sip of water and let's have a look at Discord. Here we go. Martin, I've got a question which I've already placed in the comments of the latest EOS live stream, but have not had an answer yet. I apologize for that, Martin. To point out the pros and cons of color grading raw light with Resolve versus Premiere. Premiere does not handle DNGs as well as DaVinci Resolve. Okay, Martin, first things first, I don't use Premiere, so I'm not the best person to answer this, but in terms of how they're handling the Canon Cinema Raw Light files, they handle them both the same. There's I think they call it the master effects control, which is up in the top left. So you've got like the normal effects controls, and then there's like a master effects controls. And if you have a Cinema Raw Light clip selected, then the raw parameters for that clip become available within there. And you have access to the very similar raw parameters to the raw parameters that you'll see in Resolve. And in fact, for a little while, there were more options in there than you had in Resolve, although I think that's changed now. So in terms of the way they handle that, they're both the same. In terms of working with that footage from a software point of view, the software tools in Resolve are better than the software tools in Premiere. I think that's going to be fairly clear. I mean, Resolve is its pedigree is as a color finishing tool, whereas Lumetri, is a kind of Adobe's attempt to kind of replicate more like the Lightroom controls for video, which are perfectly fine. I mean, I particularly hate the scopes in Premiere. I think they're really, really badly laid out, very low quality. The scopes the scopes in Final Cut Pro 10 were amazing, still are amazing, and really for years they were better than anything else. Actually, Resolve 16 brought out a new feature where you can have a higher quality readout for the scopes, and there's like a low pass filter. The scopes are actually much nicer. The fact you can colorize them now. There's several things to do with that. We're actually in Final Cut Pro, bizarrely, before Resolve. But actually the scopes now in Resolve are equally good. I do hate the scopes in Premiere, so that would be another con of using Premiere. I don't understand your next point. In Premiere, you've experienced that it doesn't handle DNGs as well as Resolve. Well, Cinema Raw Light isn't based on DNGs. It's not a image sequence based codec. It's a self-contained package. So I don't know if you're talking about just generally speed. I don't use Premiere, so I can't compare the two. Anecdotally and broadly speaking, Premiere is a far less stable program, I think, than others, and so that might be a reason to use it. But I don't know really if there's any material difference in terms of the speed that they handle them. With CRMs, it's not that bad, but I think Premiere Pro is not that accurate with the blues and introduces notable fragments. What is your experience with CRMs in Premiere? Right. So yeah, when you're getting down to that level of comparison, I'm afraid, Martin, I'm going to fail. I just don't use Premiere. I hate it with a passion. I was an Adobe certified instructor years ago in Premiere, and then I stopped probably about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I haven't touched Premiere really since, unless I absolutely have to for doing a conform for a client. But it's just awful. I hate it. It crashes constantly. So I don't use it. So I can't give you a decent answer as to how it compares for if it gives, like, if it introduces blues or something. I would be very surprised if any software tinted the look of your image. I mean, there's also the whole thing about, you know, the color management side of things, like the color architecture, the way that Resolve handles and displays images through its viewer, even not using external boxes to send out the image clean from the GPU, is hands down the best there is. I mean, it's incredible. It's a fully proper color managed system. So if you're seeing slight shifts in color between them, that's just the different pipelines, the different architectures and the color management systems that they're using. Again, you know, I don't use Premiere enough to actually give you a proper answer to that, I'm afraid. Tom, let me just double check. No, different Tom. Tom, how do you create export a CDL for camera? Right. That's very specific, and actually, Tom, what I'll do is I'll go that through afterwards, if that's all right. That's a very, very specific question. So I'll show you that afterwards, if you like. We can actually pick up in a separate Zoom call. Different Tom, same Tom. What do you use in Resolve to not be oversaturated for Rec 709? So in Resolve, let me go back to sharing my screen. 2 seconds. I've lost you. There we go. Share screen. It's a good question, Tom. So if you are worried about oversaturating something for your export color gamut, so if you're exporting for X709, which has a relatively small color gamut, it only covers about 30% of CRE 1931 XYZ. So there is a scope, the CIE chromaticity scope in Resolve 16. And that would actually show you, so you've got the CIE 1931 XYZ outline here, and then you've got the triangle that represents the Rec 709 gamut, and then you can see any colors that are falling outside of that. Now, the reason why you can see a few sort of traces falling outside of even actually what we can see with the human eye is just an oddity about some of the way the scopes work, but also this is raw, and it was shot in cinema gamut, and Canon's cinema gamut is bigger than actually that we can see with our eye. Excuse me. The key thing here is that you can see that the vast majority of the image is falling within that Rec 709 gamut. That's predominantly because my color management is set. So if I go to my project color management, where the project management is set up by default to keep everything within a Rec 7 and 9. So you will automatically see that happening. If you're really concerned and want complete control of it, you can also use the OpenFX. Where is it? The gamut color. Well, there's the color space transform, so you can use that to make sure that you're transforming your image to a specific gamut in the first place. But there's also a gamut limiter. You can use the gamut limiter to essentially limit the gamut of your project to exactly what you're working in. So you can also use that to make sure that you're not oversaturating things. But the final thing I would do, just as a broad guide, is on the vector scope. You will see, if we go back out to 2x zoom, you will see at the 100% representation of the vector scope, these boxes here represent the chromaticity coordinates for Rec 7 and 9. You cannot have anything more saturated than those. So if you have any traces that are even close to these boxes, I would be very concerned, and I would want to check that you weren't oversaturating for your output gamut. I'll be honest though, Tom, I'm not an online editor. It's not typically my job to let me go back to my screen. There we go. It's not typically my job to do the online checks and the QC for broadcast. So in fact, we do very little broadcast work. And when I have graded for broadcast, I've just kind of done what I've just shown you there and done my best to make sure that we're keeping things broadcast safe. But then there is then almost always a QC pass that's done by the network their end or the agency their end once I've handed that off. So I can't give you a full debrief on that online QC because it's not actually something that I have to do. Is this the book? Color Correction Handbook, Professional Techniques. Let me just double check. Yeah, that's the book. Yeah, there's the second edition is the better one to have. Yeah, so if the second edition came out in 2013, yeah, I think it must be 10 or more years since the original book came out. Yep. Hi, Ollie, what's a good mid-range cost monitor for grading? How much have you got to spend? Oh, that's
me. Yeah.
Jake was
that's
asking.
Me.
Well, my answer to that would be how. That is always a $100 question, isn't it? $1 million question rather. Mid-range to me, you can easily spend 30 grand on a reference monitor, 20 to 30 grand on a reference monitor. I would say the cheapest reference monitors are going to be sort of 2, 3, 4 grand. So mid-range between those two numbers is a relatively healthy kind of 12 to 15,000 pounds. But I would be surprised if, Chris, you turned around and said, "Oh, actually, yeah, I do have 12 to 15,000 pounds on a mid-range monitor." It's a really tricky one. I mean, if you want the absolute best, then you're going to be wanting to look at things like Canon's range of reference monitors. Their DPV 3220 is just insanely good, but it's a £30,000 monitor. If you want to save money, go for smaller ones and just bring them closer to you. So like if you really can't afford much, but you want to get good quality, then maybe look at the 17-inch ones, like the DPV 17s. They're still very good, still HDR. And much, much cheaper. Looking beyond brands like Canon, I would say, well, up until recently, I would have said someone like ISO would be a good one to look at. But ISO, I think their development, the rate at which they're bringing out newer sort of cutting edge models is really slow. I mean, some of their monitors, which they still sell as new now, have been around for many, many years. And I feel like that pace isn't there with ISO, which is, I think, has been picked up by some others. I was generally, except for one crucial area, I was very, very impressed with Apple's Pro Display XDR, which cost me, I got the nano etched one, so I think that was about 6 grand, but I think if you don't get the nano etched one, it's about 5 grand. Don't pay £1 grand for the stand, just get a Let's get a Vesa, any Vesa stand, or I've got a Vesa arm here, which was about 20 quid. That screen I was really impressed with, in terms of its spec. It's 1600 nits, maximum output. It's 6K, brilliant for monitoring the stuff out of the C500 Mark II, because I think it's the only display you can actually see a pixel for pixel image from the C500 Mark II's raw files. But I actually ended up sending mine back and getting my money back, because if you looked at one side of the frame, it was slightly blue. So basically, if you have it in front of you, eye height, exactly where you should have your monitor, not too far away, the middle would look neutral, and then the very edges of the screen would look slightly blue. And if you move your head slightly, then that side would go more neutral, and then the rest will go more blue. And if you move your head the other way, and I'm only talking sort of as much as I'm moving my head now, it would shift, the colors would shift. And I hadn't really noticed it until I had a client who unfortunately had actually come and sat next to me. So they were looking at the same image on my screen, but they were sat here. So they were looking at a more oblique angle than I was. And we had a shot that they'd filmed that had some talent on a white background. It was a painted white wall. And from where I was sitting, it looked like there was some blue, like maybe some daylight or something would be coming in. So I said to him, "Oh, if there's like a window here on the right of frame, is there some daylight coming in? It looks cool over here." And he's like, "No, all the daylight was blacked out. It was completely controlled." And what he was saying about the lighting didn't match what I could see with my eyes. And then he said, "Oh God, yeah, it looks really blue on that side." And he was talking about the opposite side to what I was referencing. I thought, what's going on here? So I got the RGB picker up in Resolve and actually moved my cursor across from left to right across the white background. And the RGB values were consistent across the whole thing. It was white, and it was consistently white from far left to far right. So both of us were like, what's going on? So we moved our heads. He came and sat where I was, I sat where he was, and it completely changed. And it was that moment. I was like, right. Packaged it up, sent it back, got my money back. And I've now it literally just arrived this week. I've actually just got the Asus PA32UCX, which I got from Amazon, I believe. Yeah, that's a 1200 nit HDR. It's got like something like high 80s% coverage of Rec 2020 color gamut. I mean, it's crazy. It's mini LED. It's really, really high spec. I've done a couple of HDR grades on it. If you have an HDR TV or phone or iPad or something, if you go to my Vimeo channel, vimeo.com/Coro Films, there's 3 little testers I've just done yesterday, which HDR grades with the C300 Mark III footage that I've also got up on my Vimeo as a link, so you can download those same files. And I did that with the new ProArt monitor. Yeah, it looks great so far. I'm really, really happy with it. I still need to get used to exactly how it sort of operates and set up, but it's a hell of a monitor for the price. I think it was £2,000 ex VAT, I think, which is kind of crazy, really.
Yeah, I'm trying to get Chris to tell me how much money he's got so he can make a recommendation.
Yeah,
because
not 15,000.
It's mid.
All
I mean, when it comes to like budgets, someone's mid could be someone else's low, someone else's high could be someone else's low.
Yeah,
it's like it's so vague. Yeah, it needs to be more specific.
The thing I would say, Chris, is that you have to be very careful buying certain brands. It's very tempting. There's basically been a big spike in the number of, on paper, very high spec monitors by sort of unknown or smaller, particularly Chinese brands. You have to just be careful. Is it warranted in your country? Is there any kind of support if it goes wrong? Are you covered? Is there somewhere to take it to get it fixed? You do have to be quite wary of that. And so sticking with proper, named brands who have European and UK based operations and support mechanisms, and are resold through people like CVP, those are the ones that you're going to have less headaches with. So you might want to be careful about succumbing to the specs. But generally speaking, if you can get something that's 10-bit, proper 10-bit, true 10-bit panel, that's at least HD. Doesn't have to be 4K. Even if you're shooting 4K for color grading, we're kind of resolution agnostic for color grading. It's lovely to be able to see it, as appreciate the final image, but you don't need it for color grading. If you can afford it, then great. But if you can't, then don't worry if it's 1080. And you want it to be something that is relatively color stable. So read up about it, read reviews, and the cheaper the monitor, the more frequently you're going to have to calibrate it. So invest in a decent probe and calibrate that monitor as often as you can, basically.
And the only other thing to note as well is, depending on what system we're using, will determine whether or not you can actually output 10-bit. So if you're on Windows, you'll need a 10 series or 20 series NVIDIA card, or obviously a Quadro. But obviously now you can use those, which is awesome, and output 10-bit over those. And then on Mac, I think it's slightly different. I think most cards can do it now, can't they? Over
I don't think Apple use any that can't. Because the only machines they've got that have like integrated Intel chips are the 13-inch MacBook Pros and stuff. But I think if you've got a Mac desktop, you should be pretty safe. Or if you've got a Thunderbolt connection, then, as I said, you can use the Blackmagic products, the Ultra Studio products, to take that Thunderbolt signal and then give you a clean 10-bit feed out to SDI or HDMI.
Yeah. Obviously, if you've got like sub kind of $2,000, BenQ do really good monitors as well. They've got some. Do you not like them?
I don't want to say the wrong thing. I realise this is being documented. And,
I've had. From the very small amount of time I've had with them, they've been okay. LG, I've had mixed things with. Some have been good, some have been bad. I've had to calibrate them quite a bit to keep them, like you say.
The higher end LG TVs are a really cheap way of getting a big, sexy looking 4K reference monitor, and I find actually if you go for like the C series one, so we've got the 55. I forget my mind's gone blank with the model numbers, but it's the 55-inch C series LG monitor. So it's the OLED 4K HDR one. Using it as a reference HDR monitor is not really up to scratch, really. But if you're just doing normal Rec 7 and 9, actually, it's really good.
Yeah.
And the newer ones, so the 2019 and onwards ones, they actually will support Calman calibration patches being sent to them as well, so you can properly calibrate them.
Awesome. All right, there's a couple more questions on Zoom as well. All right, so from Fran, I'm a self-shooter and grade my own footage. Color grading is important. What laptop do you have? Ollie, I presume that's you. Do you believe that the MacBook Pro screen is good enough for an accurate grade? Do you know a cheap way to calibrate
it? If you just look at the size of those laptop screens, I think it tells you everything about how much technology is in there. Look at the difference between a laptop screen and a proper reference monitor, which will be chunky as hell. The heat management plays a massive part in signal integrity, and that's the case whether it's the camera or the display device. If you look at professional cameras, they have vents on them, they have fans in them, they're whirling away, and then they cut when you're rolling, and then they whirl back into action. Heat management and noise and image fidelity go hand in hand. If you've got a thin panel, like a laptop screen, the heat management isn't too bad because it's so thin. Actually, it passively gets rid of that heat quite quickly. But there's all kinds of layers of backlighting technology, of heat management that go into proper reference monitors, which you just don't have in a laptop screen. The screens that Apple use are made often by Sharp or LG or Samsung, which are all very good manufacturers of LCD screens. And so they are good quality for that type of product, but you need to calibrate them, and you would probably need to calibrate them really frequently. Like if I was trying to get away with grading something on a MacBook Pro, I've got the 16-inch MacBook Pro. If that was all I had, I would calibrate it, and then I'd probably recalibrate it the next day, and then the next day, and every day that I was using it for that grade, just to make sure it hadn't drifted. because that's what happens with these cheaper monitors, is they drift, and that's the problem. What about an Atomos Sumo for monitoring? Alvin, that's exactly what I did for a while. Needs must. Tried to kind of make use of the equipment that we already had, and thought, well, we've got the Sumo as a production monitor. And actually, I hadn't even entertained the idea until I read an article. I've forgotten the guys' names. There's these two guys in LA, and they have this really good website, and they are, anyway, they know their stuff. And I was reading an article they put up about, like, can you use the Sumo for HDR grading? And the short answer is no, you can't. But for Rec 7 and 9, it's actually pretty good. I used to regularly calibrate my Sumo when I was using it for Rec 7 and 9 reference monitor. And every time I calibrated it, it would show me that actually it barely drifted. So those Sumos I was using the 19M, so just the monitor version. And I was surprised at how good it was, actually. What was tricky was the touch interface was very difficult if you were trying to adjust the brightness, and you know, to hit the 100 nits for Rec 7 and 9 Gamma 2.4, you needed to have it like 8% brightness, and it was really tricky to try and get it at exactly 8. It would like keep moving. But other than like interface considerations in terms of accuracy, it was surprisingly good. The slight downside was I don't know if this has changed, but the software, Atomos's software to calibrate it, which would have meant that I didn't have to use the technique I was using, which is actually a really nice piece of software that Atomos make, was Windows only at the time. And it involves using a proprietary cable, but it does mean you can hook straight into the monitor, and then it calibrates it, and it actually sets the internal calibration, the internal LUT for the monitor, which is really good. I couldn't do that because I don't have a Windows machine, so I would just use X-Rite software and then use it as an ICC profile, which isn't as good, but it needs must at the time. Hi, Ollie.
One quick thing. The last question that Fran said, could you recommend any books and tutorials that explore the more creative theoretical side of color grading, other than obviously the one you've already recommended? And then also a decent, cheap, affordable calibration tool for the Mac?
Well, I'll start with the latter question, and take this with there is a minor element of bias. I'm an X-Rite ambassador, so just bear that in mind. But I do think that the X-Rite, the i1 Display Pro, is probably the best good value probe. There are cheaper ones and there are much more expensive ones, but it seems to be a very solid device, not too cheap, that it's not really doing the job well, but not $5,000. I personally use the i1 Display Pro. I use the new one, the Plus one, which will allow you to calibrate up to 2000 nit HDR monitors. And in fact, one came free with my new monitor, which I don't need. So drop me an email, Fran, I'll sell it to you. What was the other question? The
good resources, books.
Resources. I think I've mentioned the kind of the main ones, really. What's this one from Brian? You don't consider Flanders Scientific OLED models as reference monitors? Don't I? I don't remember saying that. I'm not Brian. Brain available. I don't remember saying that at all. Flanders Scientific are fantastic, but they're very, very expensive. And Chris's question was about a budget screen, so that's why I didn't reference them. Flanders Scientific are amazing, absolutely amazing. Yeah.
Were the layer nodes merely for organization? And have you got any experience grading Blackmagic RAW? If so, how does it compare to Cinema DNG? He's looking at getting a G2.
I've only graded a handful of things in BRAW, and it's really good. Much better than the old Cinema DNG RAW ones that they used to produce from their older cameras. So yeah, really, really good. Sorry, my brain's gone. What was the first part of that question?
The first part was, I presume it was when you were in Resolve. Were the layer nodes merely for organization?
I think in the context that I was using them then, yes, they were just for organizational reasons. But I used parallel. They weren't layer nodes. They were layers, but it wasn't a layer mixer node that was mixing them together. It was a parallel mixer.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just, those operations were just happening in tandem, but separated. That's because of because I was manipulating one side of the frame, and it made no net effect to the final output that I was doing them that way. So it was just an organizational thing. But you can use them in a similar way if you're trying to create keys, and particularly if you're further down the chain and you need to pull in key data from a cleaner starting point that's not been affected by several other nodes. You can then reattach the RGB input from back, basically at the beginning, and you can pull your key from there, and it makes it much easier to create keys and then separate out parts of your image, and essentially kind of alter the signal processing. Okay,
Cool.
Oh, I've slumped in the frame. There we go. That's better. Any others?
Oh, that was just a thank you. Cool. I think that's it. That's all the questions we've got, mate.
Okay. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, we can leave it there. We're doing the same. Oh wait, how do you rate Lumetri? Oh god.
How do I grade in Lumetri?
How do you rate it? Like, do you think? How
do I rate it? I think I've already said. Maybe they missed my comment earlier. I hate Premiere, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with Lumetri, but you know, it reduces the entire color grading process to just sliders. You know, and the scopes are terrible. I don't like them so. But that's just my opinion. You know, I'm a passionate hater of Premiere. So you've asked, you're going to get a very biased response, I'm afraid.
There's one more question just quickly come in, and we'll quickly talk about it. Alvin says, can you confirm that you can play back Canon CRM files on a MacBook Pro 16? I have a 12-core trash can that cannot play these back.
Yeah, you can, absolutely. I can't remember. I think I may have mentioned this last week, actually, but at BSC this year, I was running, we were feeding Canon's 2000 nit HDR reference monitor directly through my 16-inch MacBook Pro, through the Ultra Studio 4K Mini, and doing a live 2000 nit HDR grade on the Cinema Raw Light files from the C500 Mark II, which are 5.9K. And actually it kept stuttering, but it would only start doing that, and it would start giving me random, like, colorful frames. But it would only start doing that about 4 hours into the day. And it's because we had to keep the laptop locked away in a cupboard which had no air holes in it, so that the fans were wearing away and it was just sucking in and recycling hot air. Assuming that you've got a more conducive environment to actually have your MacBook in, and I recommend, you know, using stands, like if you're going to be using laptops, then grab this one. Using things like these elevator stands. It lets the airflow underneath the laptop much better. If you've got a decent environment for the laptop, and particularly if it's like from the C200 or C300 Mark III, if it's the smaller 4K Cinema Raw Light files, you should be absolutely fine. My 16-inch MacBook Pro, I configured to have this top spec graphics card, which will make a big impact, more impact than, say, RAM or something like that. So yeah, just get the best CPU and GPU you can, and yeah, it should be fine. I edit and grade, as I just said, with those Cinema Raw Light files on my laptop quite frequently.
Cool. Awesome. We could leave it there, mate, and then we'll reconvene for the 2 o'clock session. Anyone has any other questions, let us know in the Discord or YouTube or Zoom, whatever, and yeah, we'll get them answered in that session.
Cool. Perfect. Lovely.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks
for joining us, guys. Bye-bye.
All right, cool.